Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today, carrying on with my Booker nonsense, here's me talking about another book from the Booker Longlist, and that is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. And I'll go into some parts that will kind of go a little bit into spoilers. I'll try and keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but I mean, a complicating factor in this is that the book before There, which is sort of a prequel to this, in many ways is a spoiler itself for the book. And I've read There, and so I'll kind of interweave bits of that where it's relevant. It is mostly a standalone book, it is worth saying. But yeah, let's get started talking a bit about this, and I'll let you know when spoilers come up. So, Wandering Stars, and it takes its name from a part to do with a part of the Bible and a sort of a Bible verse, and There has a sort of reference itself to a kind of quote from Gertrude Stein, and it kind of, both books acknowledge where that's from, but then also have gone on to separately be songs, which is also kind of interesting. But Wandering Stars and There, in terms of their timelines, are a little bit different. It's not a prequel in the sort of traditional sense of you read There and that takes you up to the start of this book. In some ways it's a little different. So Wandering Stars focuses both on everything before There, so particularly focusing on the family history of this group of people, and then focuses on the sort of aftermath of the events of There. And so although reading saying There has lost all meaning now that I've said it so many times, but the kind of timings can be a little strange in that sense because of that. But I think the book can stand alone. Now, the book itself, I should probably talk about what is actually happening in this book. So Wandering Stars is focused on a group of, mostly a family. It kind of features some other characters who are First Nations, Native American, Indigenous folk. And it particularly focuses in on the various characters and their relationships to each other, but also to indigeneity. And this is a really big common theme throughout the whole book and through There as well. It really looks at the various ways that people, particularly living in the US, have a complicated relationship to their indigenous identities. And so some of the characters in this book will sort of see themselves as being full Native American or Indian, as they often use in the book. Some will sort of see it almost as a challenge to kind of unlock kind of past memories and histories and stories from their culture and traditions to kind of inform where they are now. Some of them sort of to some degree have turned away from it. And so there's a really kind of complicated picture that's brought up. And I think the book explores that very well. And I think this is something that is where fiction works really well for this kind of discussion of really exploring this through characters of people who have this, very complicated relationship. For some of them, and again, without going into spoilers, for one character, this leads him to some quite destructive behavior. And then everyone around him was like, well, no, that's not what the ancestors wanted. You know, this is a different thing to that entirely. And so it just leads to this broad conversation about that. And in the midst of it, we see how their various relationships are also strained by parts around that. And a large part hinges on a powwow that is featured very prominently in There. And so there's the second and third parts of this book are immediately after that powwow and all the events that go down. And the bit before is a really big family history of sort of looking back, I think about sort of 80 to 100 years or thereabouts, I feel, maybe slightly less than that. And looking at the sort of family history through that. And I think part of what the book is trying to set up is the ways that our lives now, and particularly the lives for the characters in this book and for Indigenous peoples, are so often echoes of what's come before. And so for the characters in this book, for example, where that particularly echoes is in things around dependence, alcoholism, their physical and mental health, various other things. There's a plane going overhead as I do this. And so this idea of the kind of ways that those things show up later in life. So without spoiling anything, for example, there is a character who speaks quite strongly about kind of seeing a loved one facing addiction, and particularly sort of addiction around alcohol and drugs. And then in his life, suddenly starts to see how he wants to a lot of his relationship with drugs is because of this from his family. You know, there's an element where he feels closer to this character whenever he's high, for example. And I think the book is at its strongest when it really explores some of those things. I think the way this book looks at addiction and recovery, which are both really huge issues within Native American populations, sort of statistically, the dogs are now having a go at each other. Statistically, you know, there's sort of disproportionate amounts of sort of drug and alcohol abuse in some Native American communities, often linked to kind of living conditions and poverty and reservations and many other things. And so the book, I think, really explores that. And I think there's something about Tommy Orange as an Indigenous person himself being able to talk about what he sees within the community that I think is really important. And another kind of part that the book touches on really neatly, I think, with that is around the kind of sort of feeling of being cut off from yourself that can come up from not necessarily knowing what tribe or what have you you're a part of. And so there are various characters who, having acknowledged and sort of come to terms with sort of how they think about their own Indigenous identity, then almost can't do the next step because they just know that they're Indigenous, but not which tribe or what have you. And so I think the book really explores that. And I think those ideas and those themes are particularly interesting. And I'll talk about it a little bit when we go into some of the spoilers. My only issue sometimes in this book is sometimes it does feel like speeches are put in the mouths of characters in a way that feels slightly inorganic. So, you know, a character in a day-to-day conversation, and obviously you suspend some reality when you're reading fiction, right? You kind of know that not every character is necessarily going to speak perfectly, or events might seem a bit more like coincidences or what have you. But there is something sometimes in this book where characters suddenly start saying these things, these sort of big speeches, and you're like, okay, I think this is the author here wanting to say these things. And these are important and valid things to say. But sometimes it just feels like that is just sort of an insert when actually there is maybe a more organic way that characters would do that, or you can kind of trust the audience to read between the lines on some of these things. And there was a little bit of that in there as well, but typically what I did really like as well is that the author has these sort of prologues that sort of detail some element of Indigenous rights or relations or kind of lives in the US particularly. And I think the author is so crystal clear when he's writing about those in such a powerful way. And I think that's a really important part of the book, and both books really. But yeah, I think so that's kind of the thing for me with the plot. And before I go into some spoilers, I think it's also slightly, to some degree, uneven in its parts at times. The first part of this book being a kind of precursor of, you know, sort of many years before, sorry, that plane going past is quite loud. That the sort of being a precursor to the book in some ways means that you've got quite a long passage at the beginning of the book that is really important to later conversations, but does feel like quite a long setup before we then suddenly break and go into a period much further in the future. And I almost would have preferred a sort of slower, steadier thing of, you know, we have 80 years in the past, and then we have 60, and then 40, and then 20, and now we're in the current day. Something like that to kind of lead into it, because it is a little bit stark. And I think, having read There before reading this, part of me thinks if you hadn't read There, that would be especially big as a jump to go from, we're talking like, wow, isn't it really interesting talking about this sort of this family from a certain time and the kind of things that they're thinking about. Boom, we're now being told about the aftermath of a big event, and you're having to catch up quite quickly with some of the things that have happened in it. So although it is a standalone book, I think if you do have knowledge of There, it does help. If you can be bothered to read it, because I realise that's another book to kind of add on top of a long list. But yeah, anyway, there we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about spoilers. Overall, I did really enjoy it, and I think it picked up for me towards the end. I started getting a little bit lost in the middle of kind of, I say lost, less about the kind of like understanding the plot, but more kind of, I lost a little bit of focus, I think, because I think I don't know, it wasn't holding me fully at that point, but I think it pulls some things back at the end in a really interesting way, and it is ultimately a very beautiful family story, and sort of a story about friendships and various other things as well. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about this book, but with some spoilers. If you do need to leave here, please feel free to do so. So, in talking about this, I've been pretty vague to some degree about the events that happen in the middle of this book. So, at the end of there's a powwow, which is sort of a big social gathering with lots of pretty much all the characters from the book all coming along, and there is a shooting, and this shooting is picked up immediately in this book, in the second part, where we basically see the aftermath of the character Orville recovering from having been shot. And in many ways, so many thoughts go through his head about who he is and his identity. You know, for example, to some degree, thinking about, have I been saved by a kind of spiritual higher being? Is this a kind of an indigenous safety net almost, where I've been protected by someone looking out for me? Was it just pure luck? What do I now owe the community? What does this mean? How do I re-enter the world? There's a lot that this book does that I think is really well done about injury and recovery. So not only the recovery that we see about addiction, but also various other parts. And actually one that's covered really well here is, which I think ties into some very big US issues. There's a character who is injured in a sports match in his sort of earlier years, and he then starts to take some drugs as pain relief, which then leads into an addiction itself. And that is a very real thing. The opioid crisis in the US is a very big thing. And so I think, again, this book is engaging with some of those big topics. But the book then really looks at the kind of, particularly his relationship to recovery, and particularly in kind of dealing with looking back at the death of his mother, and also trying to reconcile that, because so much of the death of his mother was also related to substance abuse and addiction. And so, well, as in, he sort of sees her in many parts of her life existing in that way. And that makes it quite a difficult thing for him in terms of thinking about her death. So there's various ways that these things play out with the plot of the book. And I think particularly this book really starts to look towards the end at recovery. And there are these really beautiful passages of him looking at, of this character, going for runs and trying to avoid thoughts of addiction by almost replacing those good feelings with something else, with running, with making some nice food, with whatever. The book also looks a bit like there picks up as well about characters and weight and diabetes also being sort of indigenous people being generally more disposed towards diabetes and things like this. So the book does engage with these big issues. To some degree, and kind of like a bit like I was saying earlier in terms of some of the plot points, I almost feel that the book is doing a lot. Sometimes I think it pays off really well, but sometimes I think it's almost condensing every big issue to kind of talk about in terms of being Indigenous in the US, these kind of big headline topics. And because so many of these characters are kind of presented as giving these big long speeches, it sometimes almost does feel like these characters become ciphers in a very naked and marked way for an issue or a topic to talk about. This is not to say that they're not rounded characters in and of themselves, although I think there are so many characters that I don't think they all necessarily get their full viewing. But I think that it does sort of sometimes it kind of weakened my like of this book, if that makes sense. I think sometimes it sort of just stood as a thing that made me a bit too aware that I was reading a novel, if that makes sense. Instead of being able to get a bit more lost in the story, I was very aware at that point that I was being told a story, and the author wanted me to think a certain way. And that, in some ways, I don't know, I kind of like being given that agency as a reader to kind of trust where the author's going on that. And to kind of have some of my own thoughts within it. And in some ways I felt like the book kind of has a destination that it wants to get you to. All of that said, I still think this is a very readable and very enjoyable book. It's also been great to see so many people having a really good time with the book and really thinking about it. Um, and I think particularly, for many people, it's so rare to see a really big uh, a really big prize or sort of really big publicity for books that are about Indigenous lives. And so actually this is a really important thing as well, that, a book like a prize like the Booker is kind of has a book like this on the list. This may be people's first exposure to some of these topics, which is, and I think this is um, a good book to engage people on those. But yeah, I think overall it sort of was a book that I enjoyed. Um, I I don't know. I think, as with a bit of the Booker long list, if I'm honest, this year, I'm kind of wanting just a little bit extra, a little bit more punch, a little bit more um, kind of innovation in some ways. And maybe that's asking too much in some ways of some books, to kind of always be innovating and being this new thing. It's fine to have a good story well told, which I think this book is. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on it. And I hadn't actually realized that I'd accidentally color matched with this. This is just one of the 3 shirts I wear all the time. Anyway, I still do think it's a good book. I see why it made the long list. And I hope you've enjoyed it. If you are posting comments below, if you could avoid spoilers if you can, just for people who haven't read the whole book yet, that'd be great. But a good book nonetheless, even though I think there are some areas where it didn't fully hit for me. Anyway, take care, and I hope you're doing really, really well. Bye bye.